Hey there, fellow travelers. Welcome to the Tolkien Road, episode 327. In this episode, we'll be exploring Before the Second Age, the Fall of Númenor's summary of the events of the Silmarillion leading up to the founding of Númenor. Before we get started, I'd like to give a double up air five to our amazing fellowship. Come on, fellowship, get those hands up there. 3, 2, 1. Whoopsh. Very nice. Special thanks to this episode's executive producers, John R., Kaitlyn of Tea with Tolkien, Jacob Lockham, John H., and Eru27. Also, a shout out to those celebrating their fellowship anniversary in February of 2023: Ish of the Hammer, Jacob Lockham, Robert H., Azia V., Eric B., John R., Andrew M., Shane Wise, Lucas W., Sean S., Sarah W., John R., David Bigwood, Kat L., Sarah M., and Eric B. Thank you all so much for sticking with us over the last year. Join the Fellowship of the Road by visiting patreon.com/TolkienRoad. When you join the Fellowship, it helps us to keep on evering on and land you some cool perks along the way. Learn more at patreon.com/TolkienRoad. YouTube, hit that like button. Don't forget to subscribe, and let us know what's on your mind in the comments below. All right. I didn't realize I was already on my browser there showing the map, but that's okay. The map of Middle-earth is highly appropriate for us, right? This is a show about Middle-earth. This is the third episode of my series exploring the Fall of Númenor, the recently published collection of Second Age writings, edited by Brian Sibley. This bad boy right here, really nice book, really high-quality stuff, high-quality production. This second introduction is a brief summary of some of the events that happened in Middle-earth before the Second Age. Here, Sibley goes into the Middle-earth's legendarium internal history, putting to heavy use what is probably Tolkien's most famous letter, the Waldman Letter, in which Tolkien gave a thorough account of Middle-earth's entire timeline to a prospective publisher, that being Waldman. By the way, the Waldman Letter is a great read. I highly recommend picking up a copy of Tolkien's letters just for this letter alone. You'll actually get it if you have the Silmarillion. You get a good chunk of the Waldman Letter as in the front material for the Silmarillion, but the whole thing, all the way through the Third Age, is in the letters of J.R.R. Tolkien, and it's just a great, really valuable resource. You know, just imagine if you met Tolkien and were like, "So tell me about this Middle Earth thing from start to finish," and you're like, "You've got half an hour to tell me," and he just described it all, right? Told the whole story from creation of Middle Earth all the way through the end of what we know as Lord of the Rings, right? Really great letter, worth spending time with. We've talked a lot about it on this podcast, and I highly recommend it. So Sibley heavily exerts this letter to explain the key events of Middle-earth's early years, most of which are contained in the Silmarillion. Let's take a look at Tolkien's own explanation for what he was doing. Pull up my Kindle here. All right. So this is what he says. "Do not laugh, but once upon a time, my crest had long since fallen, I had a mind to make a body of more or less connected legend, ranging from the large and cosmogonic to the level of romantic fairy story, the larger founded on the lesser in contact with the earth, the lesser drawing splendor from the vast backcloths, which I could dedicate simply to England, to my country. It should possess the tone and quality that I desired, somewhat cool and clear, be redolent of our air, the clime and soil of the Northwest, meaning Britain and the hither parts of Europe, not Italy or the Aegean, still less the East, and while possessing, if I could achieve it, the fair elusive beauty that some call Celtic, though it is rarely found in genuine ancient Celtic things, it should be high, purged of the gross, and fit for the more adult mind of a land long now steeped in poetry. I would draw some of the great tales in fullness, and leave many only placed in the scheme and sketched. The cycles should be linked to a majestic whole, and yet leave scope for other minds and hands, wielding paint and music and drama." Absurd. Got a little verklempt there. Apologies. Yeah, so Tolkien here is kind of, giving, just imagine him, and this is a letter he wrote to a prospective publisher. This was before we had Lord of the Rings, the Silmarillion. Essentially, this is a guy who, at this point, about 15 years earlier, and at that point, it's like a whole era earlier, had published one book, one pretty well-known book, The Hobbit. and had not published anything since then. I mean, anything in that same kind of realm. He had published other things that weren't really as popular, um, and had nothing to do with Middle Earth. But here he is to a prospective publisher, and he's bearing his soul, about this like life's ambition, this life's work. What his vision, his dream of this thing would be. He calls it absurd, and I always chuckle at that because we've gotten into some interesting discussions on this channel in the YouTube comments about what he meant by that. Calling it absurd there. My take on it is he was not actually thinking that he was not actually calling it absurd, but he's kind of blushing, right? Okay, here's what I'm doing. I know probably sounds really stupid to you. I know, but it's really what I want to do, right? So, he's explaining that the dream of this thing, the whole Middle Earth legendarium, began in this idea, this really kind of big vision of creating a mythology for England. And, he may have left that behind to some degree, like over time, although, you can make the case that most of the stories of the Silmarillion kind of have that feel to them. But yeah, he was basically saying this was my dream once upon a time. And, by this time, by the way, he is almost 60, right? If not 60 when he writes this letter, right? So he's not he's not an ambitious 25-year-old at this point. He is much older, and he's revealing his dream to this prospective publisher. And he wants to tell something that includes all different kinds of genres of fiction, right? So that's all included in this. Tolkien had a strong muse, we might say, the sense of recording what was already there, something or somewhere, not of inventing, right? So he says this a little later. Let me see if I can pull this quote up right here. He says, where is it? Yes, there we go. Yet always I had the sense of recording what was already there, somewhere, not of inventing. For Tolkien, these stories were not just something he was kind of making up, he was kind of willing himself to make up, but these were stories that kind of came to him from somewhere, right? And this is that idea of the muse, right? He didn't really know where they came from, but he felt this urge to record these things that were already there. This is where it gets kind of mystical, right? It's really fascinating stuff. But that's what he aimed to accomplish with these stories of the First Age. And the stories of the First Age are the stories that precede everything. They precede Lord of the Rings. They precede the stories of Númenor in their conception, right? Not just in the terms of being chronologically first in the legendarium of Middle-earth, but in the whole process of Tolkien conceiving the entire history of Middle-earth, right? These stories, the stories of the First Age, came first. It's this quality, the sense of recording, of just being driven to make it, to capture the realness of what it seemed, of how it seemed to him. That's what makes it feel so real to us as readers, right? It results in this quality of enchantment, which for Tolkien was one of the key things that needs to happen with good fairy tales, with good fantasy. It needs to enchant the readers so that it's not this thing where they're suspending disbelief, being like, okay, I'll play along, but it's not this like game of charades, but it's this like, it's like you start hearing these stories and you're like, wow, this just seems so real. And like the best fiction always does this, right? Whether it's true stories or not, it puts you into the situation and it's told so well that it just feels absolutely real to you, and it's engrossing in that way. The best fiction tends to do this. Sibley also quotes Tolkien. A little tongue-tied today. Sibley also quotes Tolkien on the role that invented languages played in the development of the legendarium, and their role in giving names to the various characters. Out of these languages are made nearly all of the names that appear in my legends. This gives a certain character, a cohesion, a consistency of linguistic style, and an illusion of historicity to the nomenclature, or so I believe, that is markedly lacking in other comparable things. So, in other words, Tolkien is saying that languages really drove what he was doing, his creative process. Tolkien, you might know, Tolkien was a philologist by profession. So, someone who studies languages and the development of languages and the history of languages. This was his lifelong passion. This is what drove him to create his own languages. The created language thing really precedes Middle-earth, and Tolkien began doing this, and it's almost like he created these languages, and then he's like, I need stories to go along with these languages. And stories have the power to give new meaning to words, give deeper, richer meaning to words. So for Tolkien, these two things, there was kind of an interplay between the stories of the legendarium and the languages that he was creating all along. So, he created a couple of different forms of Elvish, and then eventually he would create a language for Númenor, which I'm sure we'll talk about at some later point in this series. And he created a language for dwarves as well. Now, these languages were never like fully finished languages, but some of them were more further developed than others. So, anyway, very interesting, very fascinating sort of process he had going on there. All right, so another interesting section here is when Tolkien kind of summarizes for us what the legendarium is all about. This is like a 2-paragraph summary of especially the stories of the Silmarillion, what the Silmarillion is all about. He says, the main body of the tale, the Silmarillion proper, is about the fall of the most gifted kindred of the elves, their exile from Valinor, a kind of paradise, the home of the gods, in the furthest west, their re-entry into Middle-earth, the land of their birth, but long under the rule of the enemy, and their strife with him, the power of evil, still visibly incarnate. It receives its name because the events are all threaded upon the fate and significance of the Silmarilli, the radiance of pure light, or primeval jewels. But the Silmarilli were more than just beautiful things as such. There was light. There was the light of Valinor made visible in the 2 trees of silver and gold. These were slain by the enemy out of malice, and Valinor was darkened, though from them, ere they died utterly, were derived the lights of sun and moon. A marked difference here between these legends and most others is that the sun is not a divine symbol, but a second best thing, and the light of the sun, the world under the sun, become terms for a fallen world in a dislocated, imperfect vision. But the chief artificer of the elves, Feanor, had imprisoned the light. Let me start over. But the chief artificer of the elves, Feanor, had imprisoned the light of Valinor in the 3 supreme jewels, the Silmarilli, before the trees were sullied or slain. This light thus lived thereafter only in these gems. The fall of the elves comes about through the possessive attitude of Feanor and his 7 sons to these gems. They are captured by the enemies set in his iron crown and guarded in his impenetrable stronghold. The sons of Feanor take a terrible and blasphemous oath of enmity and vengeance against all or any, even of the gods, who dares to claim any part or right in the Silmarilli. They pervert the greater part of their kindred who rebel against the gods, and depart from paradise and go to make hopeless war upon the enemy. The first fruits of their fall is war in paradise, the slaying of elves by elves, and this and their evil oath dogs all their later heroism, generating the treacheries and undoing all victories. The Silmarillion is the history of the war of the exiled elves against the enemy, which all takes place in the northwest of the world, Middle-earth. Several tales of victory and tragedy are caught up in it, but it ends with catastrophe and the passing of the ancient world, the world of the long First Age. The jewels are recovered by the final intervention of the gods, only to be lost forever to the elves, one in the sea, one in the depths of the earth, and one as a star of heaven. This legendarium ends with a vision of the end of the world, its breaking and remaking, and the recovery of the Silmarilli and the light before the sun. So, really, the Silmarillion, is the story of this creation of this world, and into this world, these godlike figures, the Valar entering, the creation of the 2 trees, which give off this, sort of divine light, right? This this light that isn't just normal light like we think of it, but is a light that kind of penetrates to the very depths of the soul. It's an incredibly beautiful light, a truly valuable light, holy light, if you will. And then the Silmarillion the Silmarilli, these 3 holy jewels being created that capture some of this light. The 2 trees are destroyed by the evil Melkor, later termed Morgoth, and then a bunch of the elves who live in this blessed realm of Valinor, where the 2 trees were, led by Feanor, the one who created the Silmarillion. They swear this oath, and they go back across the ocean to the land of Beleriand to try and reclaim these jewels. And the story, so that's kind of the first half of the story. The second half of the story is about the further struggles of these elves who have left Valinor, who have left the Blessed Realm to attempt to recover these 3 jewels from Morgoth and to defeat Morgoth, okay? That's really the summary of it all. And there's so much more of these stories, obviously. You should really read the Silmarillion. Hope you will if you have not read it already. But that kind of sets the stage for the stories of the Second Age, the story of the Fall of Númenor that will come later. So, Tolkien mentions that it's really, really the first sort of like 50%, maybe even almost 2/3 of the Silmarillion proper. There are no men. Men don't really enter into the story until later. It's all elves. It's all these immortal creatures. Think of elves essentially as men, but immortal, right? And so they're different in several ways. They're different in their nature, but they're kind of like the kindred of men, right? It's just that men are mortals. The introduction of men into the story changes things. It makes the stories less mythical and more like stories and romances. Tolkien calls Beren and Luthien the chief of the stories, even going so far as to comment that it introduces the motif of the small being greater than the powerful, the same motif that would be fully realized by the introduction of hobbits into the legendarium. So the story of Beren and Luthien is really key. And if there's any one story that I'd recommend that you read in the Silmarillion before trying to understand the stories of the Second Age, it would be the story of Beren and Luthien. It's a fantastic, just standalone chapter. It's chapter 19 in the Silmarillion. It's a fantastic story all by itself. You'll recognize Sauron plays a major role in the story, so you'll recognize him. So it's one of these Silmarillion stories that actually is a little bit recognizable if your only frame of reference is The Lord of the Rings. Highly recommend that story, and it's really important in setting the stage. And we'll actually get into this more when we talk about the next chapter and kind of start getting into the history of the Second Age itself. But it's important because Beren and Luthien are ancestors to both Elrond and Elros, who are key figures in the stories of the Second Age. Elros is the first king of Númenor, and Elrond is his brother. Elros chooses the path of mortality. Elrond chooses the path of immortality. They're half-elven. What's really interesting about the two figures of Beren and Luthien, Beren is a mortal man. Luthien is an immortal she-elf, but an elf maiden, but she's actually half-elf. She's half-elf and half Maya, which is a divine being, right? It's one of these lesser gods, right? So her parents are Thingol, an elf king, and Melian, who is a divinity. Like she's a lesser goddess, essentially, right? So we can look at that and we can say, wow, figures like Elrond, Elros, these people are actually descended from divine beings, right? From a divine being. It's pretty fascinating to consider, and it's actually really fascinating when you consider the downstream implications for characters and some of the characters in Lord of the Rings, even beyond Elrond. So, but we'll talk about all of that in due time. All right. When it comes to the Second Age, the thing that is so important to understand about the story of Beren and Luthien is that it leads to the elf-man hybrid race that would become the Númenorian line of kings and queens, as well as other well-known figures in the legendarium, such as Elrond. The stories of the Silmarillion are extremely rich and are worth the time of any serious Tolkien fan, so I invite you to pick up a copy and check out our various podcast episodes on the Silmarillion itself. You can also learn more about the story of Beren and Luthien and really kind of like the whole thrust of the First Age by picking up a copy of my book, Tolkien's Requiem. Call it a shameless plug, if you will, but lots of people have told me they've been helped by that book. It's a fairly brief read. It's not going to take you very long to read, but it's a really great little introduction via the story of Beren and Luthien. And I think it's a great path to go down if you really want to understand the stories of the First Age before you full head-on dive in to each of them, because it can get pretty complex from there. All right, so that is before the Second Age. That's the main content of what we're going to be covering in this episode. Let's hit some correspondence. I'm going to look at a note from Michael H. sent on January 1st of 2023. All right. Michael says, "Hi, I just finished your episode on the Rune of Doriath 2022. So the first 5 times I read the Silmarillion, I didn't really notice or find it remarkable that the Silmarillion and Nauglamir were delivered to Dior. And it seems that you didn't find it that remarkable either, but that unnamed elf lord from Osiriand must be one of the very few beings in all of Middle-earth's history that could resist the lust for the Silmaril. It got me thinking of Tom Bombadil and how unimpressed and unbothered he was by the ring. It made me think of Sam. I don't know if there's enough material in there for a whole show, but the resistance to temptation seems remarkable and worth looking into. Yeah, it's definitely interesting. I definitely hadn't picked up on that before, but you're right. It's right there. I'm gonna read this passage from the Silmarillion, chapter 22, just to tell you what Michael's referring to there. There came a night of autumn, and when it grew late, one came and smote upon the doors of Menegroth, demanding admittance to the king. He was a lord of the Green Elves, hastening from Assyriand, and the door wards brought him to where Dior sat alone in his chamber. And there in silence he gave to the king a coffer and took his leave. But in the coffer lay the necklace of the dwarves, wherein was set the Silmaril. And Dior, looking upon it, knew it for a sign that Baron Erchamion and Luthien Tenuviel had died indeed, and gone where go the race of men to a fate beyond the world. So Dior is the son of Baron and Luthien, the only child of Baron and Luthien, and from Dior will descend eventually Elrond and Elros, just to tie it back into our main content here today. But the thing that Michael is referring to here is this elf lord who's mentioned in passing, and the fact that he had with him this Silmaril, which everyone else seems to be tempted to want to take hold of. He has this Silmaril, and for some reason he's not tempted. Now, Michael, for me, I look at this and I think maybe he wasn't aware that that's what he was carrying. Maybe he was just aware that he had this kind of sacred mission and from Baron and Luthien, and he had to deliver this to this other person, but he wasn't entirely in the know about what he had. Right, that's one possibility. Maybe he did know, and you're right, he was just more resistant to the lure of it. I mean, there are characters within the legendarium, and Tom Bombadil is one you brought up. That's a big one. Sam seems to have a great strength to resist the lure of the ring as well. I would also say that Aragorn seems to have that ability, and even figures like Galadriel and Gandalf, even though they show temptation at times, they don't give into that temptation, even when they could, right? And it could be that this elf lord, was just kind of that strong against temptation. He was of the same sort of character in that regard as Galadriel or Gandalf, that he just had the resistance. So it's either that he didn't know what he had, or he was just of that enough character. And I have to think that if Baron and Luthien were going to entrust this mission to him, either they didn't tell him, or they knew he was of the character to resist the temptation to take this for his own, to kind of seize it for his own. I think that's entirely possible. So there you go. That's my read of that particular question. It's a really good question, and good on you for picking it up and noticing that particular detail. Wanted to read this note also from JD. I believe it's JD. Yeah, here we go. JDS. JD says, "Hello, John and Greta. Just wanted to send a quick note to say that I've been enjoying the podcast. I'm a relatively new Tolkien fan. Though I read The Hobbit many years ago in high school, it wasn't until about 5 years ago that I read Lord of the Rings for the first time. I was enthralled by the world of Middle-earth. I've reread Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit several times now and have begun to delve into some of the Tolkienian scholarship, such as the writings of Joseph Pierce. I also just recently read John's book, Tolkien's Overture. Hope you enjoyed it. Now I think it's time for me to dive into the rest of the Legendarium. Would you recommend the Silmarillion next, or is there a better place to go before jumping into that tome?" Well, JD, I would say definitely dive into the Silmarillion. If you've read Lord of the Rings, if you've read The Hobbit, then I think it's definitely worth going down the road of the Silmarillion. We've tried to provide a lot of resources to help you get started there. You mentioned you've read Tolkien's Overture. I don't think you'd said you'd read Tolkien's Requiem, so if you haven't read Tolkien's Requiem, I recommend picking up a copy. But here's the thing. I'm going to say this. I'm a big believer in try to read the Silmarillion yourself first. See what you can do with it. And if you have that much trouble and you need to go to my book first, then that's what I'm happy for you to do that. But I never want to tell people to read my book first before you read Tolkien, because I want you to be able to appreciate if kind of unfiltered and unadulterated from whatever perspective I might bring to it. So I hope that you can make that journey like by yourself. And I wouldn't say necessarily that you couldn't like listen to our podcast episodes on these particular things after you've read a chapter. it's just that I want you to be able to really appreciate what Tolkien wrote himself before you read my take or anybody else's take on what it's about, on what it means. I just think there's value in that, going directly to the source and attempting that. But that being said, it is a challenging work, so whatever help my work in the book, Tolkien's Requiem, or my work on the podcast would be to you, I'm happy that it does that. So hope that helps, JD, and I would give that same advice to anybody else who is in the same shoes as JD. All right. Well, that is it for this episode. Please subscribe, rate, and review us on iTunes or the platform of your choice. If you are a 5-star fan of the Tolkien Road, you can really help us out by heading over to iTunes or your preferred source for the show and dropping us a rating and review. When you do that, it helps get the word out about the Tolkien Road, which helps us to keep on evering on. Drop us a line, just like JD and Michael. YouTube in the comments, TolkienRoad.com, email, TolkienRoadPodcast@gmail.com, Twitter, or wherever you can find us. We'll do our best to respond to you somehow and at some point. Thank you to our amazing patrons, especially the following: John R., Kaitlyn of Tea with Tolkien, Jacob Lockham, John H., Eru27, Emilio P., Jonathan D., Mike M., Robert H., Paul D., Julia, Werty, JoeBagelMan, Jacob S., Richard K., Matt R., Matthew W., Garret P., Chris K., John W., Eugene D., Chris B., Daniel S., Seb M., Shayna Supreme, Ms. Anonymous, Andrew T., Red Hawk, Shannon S., Brian O., Zeke F., James L., Chris L., Chuck F., Azia V., Ish of the Hammer, Teresa C., David of Pints with Jack, Eric B., and Johanna T. Thank you all so much for your support. We truly appreciate all of our patrons, and we appreciate everybody watching and or listening. We'll talk at you next time. Bye-bye.